Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Tech Tuesday session. My name is Vanessa, and today we're going to be talking about the NIH public access policy. So thank you for joining us. With me, I have Drew Wright, who's our scholarly communications librarian, and he's going to be taking you through the policy. And this is a perfect opportunity to ask any questions you might have about it. Before we begin, I just wanted to let everyone know that I am recording today's session. So if you missed something and need to go back over it or even want to share this recording with colleagues, I'll be sending a follow-up email after the session is over with a link to the recording as well as any other links that Drew might bring up today that has resources or anything that's helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat at any time. I do have everyone's mics muted just to limit background noise, but again, you could just put it in the chat and we will stop when we can and answer any questions you may have. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Drew. Thanks for being here today, Drew.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Vanessa. Let me scroll back. So hello, my name is Drew. I'm like Vanessa said, I'm the scholarly communications librarian here at Weil. So essentially what that means is I work kind of on both sides of the publishing game. So we'll work with y'all to navigate you through the publishing process as you're yeah, kind of going through your research and getting towards the publication side of things, and also on the backside. So we help out with reporting publication output, research output to the institution, and then we also help OSRA with things like public access compliance with the NIH. So essentially, what we're going to do today is go through the policy, very brief. On the surface, the policy is relatively simple. It's the implementation and some of the little nuances that can get a little tricky. So we'll do a brief overview of the policy, talk about some distinctions and definitions that can sometimes be confusing. I'll do like a little kind of demo in the slides of how to kind of start from scratch and begin the compliance process, and get it to where we're sort of at the end. I was going to do it live, and I usually do it live. The system is a little sluggish today, so instead of sitting us or letting us sit here and kind of like watch a page load for 15 seconds, we'll just do it in the slides and move on. And then we'll just talk about some other kind of tangential areas. I'll show you some of the resources that we have to sort of help out answer any questions that might pop up. This probably isn't going to take all that long, because usually in these sessions, what's really helpful is answering questions and getting feedback from y'all. Because like I said, the policy and the implementation of it itself is relatively straightforward, and it works really well when it works, but when it doesn't and things kind of start to get out of sync, there's some issues that kind of pop up there. So if at any moment you have any questions while we're going through, please feel free to just pop something in the chat, reach out, and so we can sort of answer it as we go along. My throat's also a little weird today, so if I go silent really quickly, it's because I'm coughing. I didn't want to do it in the mic, so be aware of that. All right, so what is the actual policy? So sort of broken down into layman's terms. At the moment, as of May 2024, we are still on the policy that came out in 2008, which essentially means that all NIH-funded work must be available in PubMed Central in a record based on the manuscript within 3 months of publication, to be made available publicly within 12 months of the publication date. There is a new memo that came out 2 years ago, I think at this point, that is working to remove that embargo. So now there's a 12-month embargo, and starting no later than the end of 2025, that embargo is going to be reduced from 12 months to 0 months. So anything that is NIH funded is going to be made immediately available in manuscript form in PubMed Central. There's a lot of debate right now about how exactly that's going to work. And by the end of this year, we'll know the details about the plan that's going to come out. But I'll show you where you can get some links to some of the discussion that's happening there. But you can be rest assured that probably around summer or fall of next year, we'll be doing a full court press on educating and letting people know what the new policy is. But for now, we're sticking with the older one. So we're doing NIH funded work manuscripts that are generated from that must be available in PubMed Central um, within 3 months to be made publicly available in 12 months. And we'll sort of reference sort of this as we go through the talk. Um, so I first want to kind of get through three definitions and distinctions that kind of pop up all the time when we're talking about the NIH public access policy. And the first is PubMed versus PubMed Central. So the policy dictates manuscripts need to be in PubMed Central. So there's frequently a lot of confusion about what PubMed Central is and how it relates to PubMed, because most of your work is going to be in PubMed. But just because it has a PubMed record doesn't mean it's in PubMed Central, and it doesn't mean that you're compliant with the policy. So what PubMed is it's essentially an overlay of the Medline database. It has tons of bibliographic records, mostly abstracts, available via link outs to various publishers. No manuscripts or information or full articles really live on PubMed. It's essentially an abstraction service. It's a link out service. PubMed Central is confusingly named, agreed, but it's the place where all of our full text manuscripts generating from NIH funded work live. So it's freely available to the public. It is not open access. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of that distinction in just a second. But it is free, fully available, full text archive of all NIH funded work, especially from 2008 and on. There is some archival stuff in there as well. So similarly named, they even kind of look similar, but they do have a very different sort of purposes, and especially regarding to NIH public access policy. So the policy states all full text manuscripts need to be in PubMed Central. PubMed sort of along for the ride. Before I move on, any questions about that distinction? Cool. So we'll move on. So one of the things that I've mentioned already is this concept of what a manuscript is. And the NIH policy dictates full, final peer-reviewed manuscripts. And what they mean by that is essentially the last version of the manuscript that gets sent to the journal that has sort of taken into account all of the reviewer comments and has not yet been sort of glammed up, cleaned up, copy edited, had new graphics made, and things like that for the journal. That version of the article is called the version of record. And that's the version that you can download directly from the journal's website from PubMed. And when you talk about journal articles, that's typically the version that people are thinking about. So we'll sort of kind of shorthand these to manuscript and article. So when we're talking about manuscript, we mean that final peer-reviewed manuscript. When we're talking about article, that article that you get from the journal. So now the policy mandates the manuscript at minimum. So if you have an arrangement with the publisher, you can sometimes put the article into PubMed Central, or the journal itself will do that for you. And we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of that, but not all journals do that. It usually comes with a price tag, and you will always at minimum need to have that final peer-reviewed manuscript to put into PubMed Central. If it helps you to think about it, such if you're at this stage in your career, you've probably already written a bunch of papers. So you can think of PubMed Central as its own journal. The submission process is very similar. There's a copy editing step, which we'll talk about later. There's basically everything that's parallel to the traditional journal submission system. There's just no kind of reviewer feedback, because that's already been done. It's essentially an upload, copy edit, and then we move along to the final record being published in PubMed Central. So any questions between a manuscript and an article and what the NIH wants you to provide? Cool. So the issues that come along with this obviously can be if you're the PI of a paper and you're submitting a grant report and you notice that there's a paper that hasn't been submitted into PubMed Central yet, you may not have the final peer reviewed manuscript if you're a senior author, or you weren't necessarily involved in writing the paper or doing a lot of the nitpicky reviewer comments and things like that. So you may not actually have the manuscripts in your possession. So sometimes it does require a little bit of legwork to track that down and to figure it out. So in order to sort of combat that, start thinking of having like kind of like a central location where a lot of these manuscripts live, so there's not like one person that has the manuscript, that may leave the institution or for whatever reason just not be reachable, just so everyone has a copy and can pull it in at a moment's notice if you need to. The journal can sometimes also supply this back to you, as well, if you really get in a pickle and you have to ask them for it. All right. So now we'll move into sort of like the biggest distinction, between, and probably the biggest source of confusion about this particular policy. So public access is fairly self-explanatory. It's access that the public has to the research. And it's kind of like a term that the NIH sort of like made up to describe the policy here. Um, Open access is something that's very different to some people, and to others, the difference is so negligible or not very practical, so they don't even really think about it. But there's a lot of confusion about whether or not the NIH policy is an open access policy or an open access mandate. The answer to that is a flat, unequivocal, like no. Open access basically means free and made availability of all articles. So everything that's generated from the journal itself, the final glam flashy PDF with no restrictions, very loose copyright typically for reuse and things like that, and more importantly, no embargo, so that immediate release. While there's tons of evidence that says that publishing open access is good for your scientific impact, it's good for readership, obviously. Um, it is not required by the NIH to comply with the public access policy. So you may choose to spend a large amounts of money to publish articles open access, just to give people access immediately to the work. But that is not a requirement for the NIH. So if you're spending open access money just to comply with the NIH, please don't don't do that. There, like I said, there are benefits of publishing open access. Apart from that, just within the context of the policy, not a requirement. The new policy that might take place in a couple of years could kind of tweak this or change this a little bit. Again, we're not immediately sure on how that's going to be implemented, but again, at the moment, not a requirement. It's not an open access mandate. It is a public access policy, and those two things are very different. The journals will sometimes be a little sly in how they word these kinds of statements on their websites. So be aware of that. If you're NIH funded and you need to comply with the NIH policy, you do not need to publish open access, full stop. And if any publisher gives you grief about that, let us know, because we can reach out to them and hopefully come to a consensus on that. All right. Any questions on the difference between open access and public access, kind of within the context of the NIH policy? Cool. So yeah, this could be a whole kind of session on its own, where we sort of get into the nitty gritty details here. To get a little bit into the weeds, if you do choose the public access with a journal, sometimes they will do some of the steps to comply with the NIH policy for you. Like you will often be able to supply the article instead of the manuscript to PubMed Central, which can sort of speed up the process and make things a little easier and quicker. Um, does that justify the 1,500, 2,500, 3,000, $5,000 price tag that comes along with paying for the open access? That's up to the sort of researchers to decide that. All right, so we've sort of gone through a little bit of definitions there. So what are the types of materials that are affected by this policy, and what are you kind of expected to contribute to, or to upload to PubMed Central when the time comes for that. So here's the criteria, the distinctions here. Really, at this point, the only sort of practical thing that we need to be concerned about, the dates, we're so far removed from the dates, not really a problem anymore. But we're really only interested right now in peer-reviewed original research. And peer review is fairly self-explanatory. We're talking, research articles, some reviews. We're not talking typically letters, comments, editorials. Um, replies, things like that, we're not necessarily interested in. So you can upload them to PubMed Central if you like, but you're not required to by the mandate. Original research is a little trickier to kind of wrap your head around. There's some debate about what that actually entails. So we sort of just draw the line at peer reviewed. If you publish an article in a journal and it's peer reviewed and it's NIH funded, it goes into PubMed Central, no questions asked. If it's not peer reviewed, you have a choice whether or not to move it up or not. Should note that peer review is not like editorial review. So sometimes invited articles or invited reviews won't go through what we consider a traditional peer review, and that would be up to the authors to decide whether or not they want to include it in their RPPR or grant application or something like that. So any questions about materials? What is part of the policy and what's not? Cool. So we sort of laid out the very kind of broad rules, and what happens if we decide that we don't want to do this. So the two kind of negative things would be your renewal or your application could be delayed because there'll be some back and forth, or they'll reach out and say, okay, we know that this article is resulting from this funding and hasn't been made compliant yet. A lot of times these things won't make it through the OSRA process. Like there'll be some pushback there. Um, so you might not get it all the way to the NIH if you're not reporting every piece of information that you're uh, interested in reporting that resulted from NIH funding. And in extreme cases, your application or renewal can get flat out rejected. I haven't heard of this happening in a while, so I don't know if this is still a thing or not, but it is definitely something that could happen. So theoretically, you've published a bunch of work on NIH-funded grants, and you are not putting those papers into PubMed Central. If it's kind of like a systematic or like a willful disobedience, I guess is like the word for it, that could come with some repercussions down the line. Like I said, I've very early on there were some issues like that. We're talking like 2012-ish, but I haven't heard anything in a long time. So I don't think we're in the the issue there yet. So another thing that happened I didn't want to put on the slide because we don't ever want to actually encourage it, but it is a valid approach, is you can just choose not to ever report that paper as being NIH funded. And that is not something that we ever want to do. But you can basically never attach grant funding to that article in any of the NIH systems. And you should be okay. If it's just a really problem paper that you cannot track down manuscripts for, or it's just being very tricky, again, that's extreme last resort. And come to us at the library or ask Osra if you have any questions about that. We should be able to avoid doing that pretty much every time. So any questions about the consequences? Cool. Um, so I guess I should also say in this part, so I have access to kind of like one of the like medium backend systems that tracks compliance for the institution as a whole. And if it dips down below a certain threshold, I start emailing kind of like reminders and notices that people's publications are not in compliant, and that you could potentially run into issues when you go to fill out your RPPR, your grant application. I haven't had to do that because as an institution, we're pretty good. We have a pretty high compliance rate. I haven't had to do that in a while, but I do check every now and then, once a month, just to make sure that we're all like generally okay. So if I do notice our non-compliance numbers start to go up, you will probably be hearing more and more from me via email blasts. So we do monitor it institutionally. So we are keeping an eye on how everyone's doing with that. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out offline. Or if you get a strange email from me, that's another reason for that as well. All right. So what are the steps? So we've talked about the policy. We've talked a little bit about what happens if we don't do it. So now we're going to just very briefly go into why we are, what we can do to make this process as seamless as possible. So it's essentially 4 steps. Again, as I mentioned before, it's very easy and straightforward on the surface, but these things don't always work as well as they're supposed to. So first step is you want to add the record to your MindCBI bibliography. Um, you should have a MindCBI bibliography linked to your ERA Commons account. If you don't, log in using your ERA Commons credentials into MindCBI, and you should be good to go. And anyone can do this who's related to the paper. So any author or PI can do it, or a MindCBI assigned delegate. So in one of the guides that I'm going to link to you later, there's instructions on how you can assign the library as a delegate if you want to, so that we can sort of manage your MindCBI bibliography and put papers in as we see them, so that all records, theoretically, or a lot of them should be in your ERA Commons account, in your My Bibliography account. But you can delegate anyone. So research assistants, DAs, lab administrators, things like that, can all be an assigned delegate. There's no kind of rules for uh, who can do that. So pretty much anyone can add a record to your My Bibliography account, MindCBI. The second step you always want to do is link the award that you're interested in to that record. So sometimes PubMed will know, based on the indexing from the journal or work that's been done in other systems, which grants funded which papers. But they don't always know that. So you always need to make sure that if you wrote a paper and you reference a grant in it, or you need to connect them, you need to do that in MindCBI, My Bibliography. And we'll show you how to do that in just a second. Again, anyone with ERA Commons credentials can do that, or anyone that is a delegate can do it. So you don't even have to be an author or a PI. So I do this for people, very frequently. I'll link grant records to articles in MindCBI accounts. So it's not a limited access thing at all. All right, from there you begin the submission into their sort of like editorial review platform called NIH manuscript submission to the NIHMS. And again, anyone with ERA Commons credentials can do this. Again, I do this on people's behalf fairly frequently, and some journals will do this for you. And there should be like a big asterisk there, because the journal, the way that journals decide what they're going to do and what they can't do is very convoluted and complicated. And there's the guy that I'm going to link to later, it goes into the details there. But even if the journal says that they're going to do this for you, whether you've paid them to do it or whether they have an agreement with NIH and all that stuff that they're going to do it for NIH funded work, there's no repercussions for them not doing it. So the onus is always on the PI and the authors to make sure that what the journal said they were going to do, they did. So even if you have made an agreement with the journal to do this, double check, triple check that they actually did it, because you're the one who's going to be on the hook for it. The journal does not care. So that's something to be aware of. So some journals will deposit it into the NIHMS for you. And then to complete this submission, you're essentially just approving the new PubMed Central formatted version of the manuscripts. And here's where it gets most restrictive. So either an author or a PI, or the journal, if you've made that arrangement with them, has to do it. So me as like a third party kind of support person, I can add the record to the bibliography. I can link the record to the award. I can start the submission in the NIHMS, but only an author or PI can do the final approval for most cases. So you need to keep an eye on your emails when they send you a notification that says, hey, this is ready to be approved. You literally just have to go in and hit approve. It takes like 5 seconds, but you just kind of have to be aware that that message is coming for you. Because if it sits there, it can take a long time, and it can eventually uh, expire, and then you have to sort of start the whole process again. It's a huge pain in the ass. So I'm going to just show you again via screenshots really quickly, kind of what all of these steps look like. But any questions before I do that? Cool. So sending records to the bibliography is relatively straightforward if you are familiar with using PubMed and MindCBI in general. So you log into your MindCBI account with your ERA credentials. That's one of the login options. You go to the record that you want to add. You click Send to My Bibliography. And essentially what that does is it pulls it into your bibliography, which is what gets read by ERA Commons. So you don't actually add papers to ERA Commons, you add them to my bibliography, and then they get pulled into ERA Commons. It's not the most efficient system, but when it works, it works. But in order to do that, it has to be in your bibliography linked to your ERA Commons account, which will happen when you log in with your credentials, or log in with someone else's credentials. That gives you delegate access. And then if it's NIH funded, which this paper is not, but you go to add award. And essentially, I didn't take a screenshot of that, but the add award, you literally just paste in the name of the grant number, and you're good to go. The next thing you want to do is edit status, and that begins the submission into the NIHMS if it's NIH funded. So if it's not, you would change this to no. If it is NIH funded, but it's not peer reviewed, say it was a a letter, editorial, or something like that that you chose to attribute NIH funding to, you could check any of these boxes, and then it becomes essentially compliant. It becomes NA, so you don't have to worry about it with the policy itself. So once you basically click that begin submission step, it kicks you into the NIHMS system, which again is sort of like the submission platform for traditional journal articles. This is the general process. So you deposit your files as if you're another journal. Whoever is dictated as a reviewer. So anyone who is an author or PI or a designated person reviews that initial deposit. The copy editing step, which they call the conversion step, happens. The final approval happens. Again, that's something the author or the PI has to do. And then at this step, you get the PMC ID assigned, which is kind of your receipt for compliance, and the article becomes available in PubMed Central after the designated embargo date. Steps 1 and 2 are relatively instantaneous. Between step 2 and 3, they say it takes 2 to 3 weeks. That's generous. It can sometimes take a little bit of time to step through everything, especially when there's deadlines coming up. So we usually recommend a month lead time. If you need it to be available in June, start the submission process now, and then you should be okay. Just to be on the safe side and aware of what that is. As far as like step-by-step tutorials go, they actually have incredible tutorials, shockingly, at the NIHMS site directly. So it's way better than anything we could do. So we'll push people there, and incredible step-by-step instructions on how to do absolutely everything in the NIHMS system. So definitely check that out. So I had a question from Thomas. So how are discrepancies among multiple authors doing NIH submissions for the same manuscript? So everything is linked to by the PMID, which is the record in PubMed. So this number here. So if someone tries to upload a manuscript in the NIHMS for a record that's already been, it will not let you do it. It'll say, hey, this is a duplicate. And it'll essentially force you to cancel the submission. So if it's being pulled in from PubMed, it will have a PMID associated with it. Occasionally, some people go rogue and they don't pull the record in from PubMed. They do like a manual entry situation. into the NIHMS, and that can be very tricky. But the sort of back door uh, sort of thing to help keep that from happening is they also match on the DOI. So not all articles will essentially have a PMID. It is possible that you publish in a journal that isn't indexed by PubMed. Um, Please don't. Publishing in a PubMed index journal makes everything way easier. But it does happen sometimes for various reasons. But almost all published articles are going to have a DOI. So if they're using either the PMID or the DOI, it'll match and it'll say, hey, this is a duplicate. If neither of those are happening, it's possible that you could have an issue, and that typically has to be resolved by the NHMS people. So you have to reach out to them and support at their support contact and get it cleared up. Does that answer your question? All right, so that's all the sort of like prepared stuff I had. If you ever have any questions or any support, we have an email me directly at drw2004, or we have a guide that I can paste into the chat. Whoop. We don't need the plus. That we paste in the chat, and any sort of questions that come up. We try to have just like very broad guidance there. But a lot of the times when people have questions, it's because there's like some weird issue that's occurred, and they're not necessarily covered by any of the walkthroughs or the guides. So please feel free to reach out and we can get it straightened out. And then if it's something that we see frequently, we'll just add it to like the FAQs or whatever. And so we don't have to worry about that going forward. But any questions about this process in general, or any like horror stories or anything like that that anyone has that they want to get off their chest or share?
Yeah, and if anybody wants to come off the mic, you can raise your hand under the React menu on your Zoom taskbar, and I'm happy to unmute you if it's easier to speak out loud rather than just typing it in the chat. And
Well,
for
so
those,
yeah,
oh,
yeah. Go ahead.
sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead, Drew.
No, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna I know a few people came in late. I just wanted to let you know we have recorded today's session, so if you missed anything in the beginning, we'll be forwarding you an email with a link to this session as well as the links that Drew has added to this presentation. Go ahead, Drew. Sorry about that.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I'll paste the announcement or the most recent announcement from the NIH for the kind of updated version of this policy, which again will not take into effect for another year and a half. Um, but just so you're aware, because it could be possible that things that you're working on now, may or may not be published for a year and a half. So it could be something um, that's you might want to start to pay attention to and sort of get involved in the conversation with. But like I said, when the details get hammered out here, we're going to be very aggressive in our uh, kind of like our education in our language when we start kind of training people on the new policy, because there's a potential that it could be very different. So if is extremely different, we'll sort of have to do a lot of retraining and things like that. So it's something to keep an eye on for the next, again, year and a half ish, while that gets straightened out. um, yeah, like I said, the only other thing I'll add is um, the three different systems that all talk to each other. It's the MindCBI PubMed, and the NIHMS and ERA Commons. They're not completely in sync. So it's possible that you may have done some of these things, like added the award to the bibliography or added the paper to your bibliography, added the award, and started the submission and all that stuff. And it may not be reflected in some of the other systems yet. So pretty frequently we get folks that come in and say, "Oh, I've attached the award to the publication, or I've started the upload, but it's not showing it as compliant or whatever in my RPPR. What do I do?" And really you have to sort of wait a couple days before everything syncs across all the systems. Sometimes it's very quick, almost instantaneous, and sometimes it takes a couple days. So that's another reason why we recommend kind of giving you that buffer from submitting into the NIHMS to when you actually need the PubMed, the PMCID to be issued, just because you don't know exactly how in sync everything's going to be. So that month buffer, an extra 2 weeks on top of their recommendation comes in handy really, really quickly or really well. Anything else? Awesome. That's all I got. That's all I got.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
if there are no questions now, but you have some later on, feel free to just reply back to the email that I send out with all the follow-up information. I'll be sure to copy Drew on that as well, so you have his contact info. And other than that, thank you, Drew, so much for taking us through this, and to everybody here for taking some time to learn more about the NIH public access policy. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.